There we go. We're going to start.
Hello everyone and welcome to my studio. I am excited to be here today to share with you a presentation and a demonstration on the idea of having a sensational start for a successful painting. That's the overall theme for today. And before I get started, I want to first of all thank you for joining me and of course for inviting me to share with you today. It's always a pleasure when I get an opportunity to share some of the things that I have learned and pass them on to you. I'm hopeful that very soon we'll be able to meet in person, but this is the next best thing, so I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share with you today. I do want to go over some of the logistics of what I'm going to do today, my presentation, and what you can expect for the next hour or so. I think we have a 2-hour max. First of all, since this is not really a live demonstration, we can't interact with one another as if we were in person. So the next best thing is that you can contact me and ask your questions. Now, typically, after I do a demo or presentation, I don't get a lot of questions because I tend to talk a lot. And that means I probably will answer your questions throughout the course of the demo. But what I recommend is that you grab a piece of paper and a pencil, and if a question pops up, write it down. If by the end of the demonstration I have not answered your question, then I want you to let me know, because I want to make sure, I don't want to leave anyone hanging. I want to make sure I answer everyone's questions. So you can either send me an email, which is simply karenmargulis@gmail.com, and I'm going to give you guys all of this information, or this is a YouTube video, so there'll be a comment section. You can ask your question in the comment section and I'll be notified, and then I'll be able to answer you that way. So you have 2 ways to make sure that you get your questions to me, and then that way we kind of have some closure. If you've got questions, I want to be sure that I can answer them for you. Alright, so with that out of the way, what I want to do today is I'm going to first talk to you just a little bit about this idea of having a good start, which will lead to a more successful painting. And I'm going to cover some of the basics of what makes a good painting, what is a good painting, and then we're going to talk about how I like to incorporate a plan in order to have a more successful painting. One of the things that I like to say in my workshops is make a plan, but plan to let go. And that actually applies to anything in life. We just got back from a month-long camping trip out west, and I had a plan. We actually had reservations a year in advance, but there was a couple of times, due to weather mostly, that we cut the trip short and added a day somewhere else. You know, so make a plan, but plan to let go, and that it applies to painting, and I'll explain how when I talk a little bit more about that. But after I give my little introductory talk, I'm going to show you how I put these things into action and do a full pastel painting demonstration for you. Alright, so that's what you can expect for today, and I want to get started by talking about what is a good painting. Let's make sure we're all on the same page where that is concerned. And so for me, my goal when I paint is to take my subject matter and interpret it with my own heart, with my own mind, based upon my own memories. So I am not about copying my reference. I'm more interested in interpreting my reference. And I want to make sure that I, excuse me, include the viewer and have them participate and become a part of the story, or at least start to make up their own story based upon what I'm painting. So I want to leave a little bit of to the viewer's imagination. So that's my number one goal. My number one goal is to interpret my scene, my reference, and invite the viewer to participate in the painting. Now, how can I make that happen? Well, number one, I have to have a plan, and I have to have a goal or concept in mind. In other words, I have to know why I'm painting that subject so that I know what to do to get my message across. So that's important. the second thing is I want the painting to be strong enough so that it draws the viewer in from, say, across the room, or maybe if you're browsing on a computer, it's a painting that jumps out at you and causes you to want to move in closer. So in other words, if you enter a room and there's paintings hung up on the wall, I want my painting to speak to you from across the room so that you are interested enough that you're going to come closer. And when you get closer, I want you to be able to participate. In other words, I don't want everything all spelled out. I want to leave a little bit for your imagination so that you can look at the painting and become a part of it. That, to me, is a successful painting. But I want to share some other thoughts because that's my personal goal. But I came across this several years ago. Another artist shared this book with me, Art for Dummies. And I know that sounds silly, like, oh, that's got to be a silly book. But it actually has some pretty profound things in it. And one of the things that I'm going to just simply read this to you is, to judge whether a work of art is any good, you want to ask the following questions about it and see how many you can answer yes. All right? And these are some of the things that I like to keep in mind when I am painting and when I'm evaluating work, whether it be my own or whether it be students or if I'm judging an exhibition. These are the things that I ask myself. Does it express successfully what it's intending to express? In other words, does the artist have a concept or goal in mind, and can you tell what it is? Does it amaze you in a different way each time you look at it? Does it grow in stature? Does it continually mature? Does its visual impact of mysterious pure power increase every day? And finally, is it unforgettable? And I like these ideas, these questions, because to me, that's truly the earmark of a successful painting or work of art. If you see it and you leave, but you still think about it, right? Oh, that painting I saw, it really was amazing, or whatever it is. And it continues to amaze you, like you don't just forget about it. To me, that is a strong painting. Now, of course, judging a work of art is going to be subjective, because what amazes me might not amaze you. And so there's always that air of subjectivity, which is why it makes it so tricky when we're entering exhibitions and we're being judged, or we're trying to get signature status and all that. There is a little element of subjectivity that goes along with it. But I think that if you're painting from your heart and you're painting something that you really love and you have an idea in mind and you utilize successfully the basic concepts of what makes a good painting, which we're going to get to, then I think you're going to have a better chance of having a successful, strong work of art. All right, so what are some of the things that we need to consider, some of the technical things, I guess you could say, that we need to consider when we are painting, that we want when we want to have a so-called good painting. Number one, we need to have a technical mastery of our medium. So with pastel, we need to be able to layer pastel without creating mud. We need to know how to manipulate the pastel so that we can make interesting marks, that kind of thing. But beyond that, we need to have a good grasp on the basic concepts of what makes a good painting. And so once I realized this, I thought, well, how am I supposed to remember this? Well, I came up with something I think is a little bit silly, but it helps me remember it, and I want to share it with you. So just come a little bit closer with the camera so we can see my equation for a good painting. Now, I am not a math person, but I thought it was kind of funny that I'm putting together an equation, but it really helps me remember. So here we go. It's D plus V plus C equals P100. Now, P100 stands for good painting. Okay, so what does this mean? It means we need to consider the design or the composition And then we need to consider the value structure of the shapes in our painting, and then we need to consider the color. And if we have success with all these three things, chances are we're going to have a good painting. And it goes in this order, actually. And a lot of times with pastel especially, we think, oh, color, that's the most important thing. We're drawn to pastel, most of us anyways, because of the color. It's just like you see a box of pastels and it's so exciting. And a lot of times I've done this myself, think, oh, well, something's wrong with this painting. If I just add this color, or if I, put in more color, it's going to fix it. But in reality, this is the last thing we need to consider, because if you don't have a strong design and a strong value map, and I'll talk about each of those, then all the color in the world that you throw on the painting is not going to make it better. So color is actually last. You need to have a strong design, strong value map, and then a thought for color or a plan for your color if you want to have a good painting. Let's break this down just a little bit more. I'll scoot this over. So, design or composition. It's how you arrange the shapes. How do you simplify your subject into just a few basic, simple shapes? And how do they interact with one another? You have to consider the size and the placement of the shapes, as well as the negative space around them. Can your eye travel around the painting? Are you going to plan for an area or areas of interest? Are you going to run into any compositional problems? Now, in this quick 2-hour demo, I really can't spend as much time as we would need on all three of these. I mean, we could do a workshop on each one of those, a multi-day workshop. So this is kind of just a quick overview, but you do need to consider your design first. First have a concept or a story to tell, then think about how you're going to simplify your subject. Then number 2 is value. Now I could spend hours talking about value, so I'm going to simplify it just to say that value, I always like to say value is the key to a successful painting, because value allows us to create depth, it allows us to create form, and if we have spotty values, meaning too many little pieces of light and dark and middle values, a spotty painting is a flat painting. And when we're creating a landscape, we want to have a believable feeling of depth and form, and we need to have strong, simple value shapes. I like to use typically 3 to 4 values when I'm blocking in my painting. Dark shapes, light shapes, and the middle value shapes. Then once you have this in place, then you can plan for your color. You want color harmony in your painting. Is there a relationship between the various parts of the painting? I'm going to talk more about this as we go on once I start painting. But the whole idea is, think of this equation before you start a painting and put it into action by making a plan, and then you're going to be more successful. So how do I make a plan? What do I do to make a plan? I do 3 things. I do a quick value thumbnail. I assign each value in the thumbnail a value. Is it a dark shape? Is it a light shape? Is it somewhere in between? I take this simple value study and I use it to start the painting. And I'll show you that in just a minute. Then I plan for my color. And many times, I like to have, well, all the time, I like to have a simple, limited palette. And oftentimes I'll just choose a few pastels from my main pastel box and put them in a tray, and those are the pastels I use for the painting. Another way that I like to do it is just to use a selected set. So like I have a set of Terry Ludwig pastels. It's the Floral Landscape set, and I curated this set so I know that it is useful for landscapes, and that it is limited palette, and that it just saves me a lot of trouble. Because the number one problem we end up with when we have problems with colors, we just use too many colors. So keeping that palette limited. So part of my plan involves selecting the pastels I'm going to use for the painting. So what I want to do now is move into the demo phase of the of this presentation. And to do the demo phase, I'm going to take you through the steps I do for the plan, and then we'll do the block in, and then we'll start to apply the pastel. So I will get everything ready, and I'll be right back, and we'll start in with the plan. All right, I'm going to take you through the steps that I use to make a value thumbnail. And if you are interested in this, I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, but if you're interested in this, you can go to my blog or website, KarenMargulis.com, and go to the blog archive and search for value thumbnail. And I have done quite a few posts on how I go through this, why I do it this way, that kind of thing. I'll also take a minute right now to say that if you're interested in more online instruction, I have a Patreon group, and I have gone over value thumbnails extensively. So there's almost 4 years of content in that group that you have access to, and I'll give you the link for all of that at the end of the video. All right, so how do I do a thumbnail? Let's first of all look at the reference photo that I'm going to be using. I tend to like to use photos that are not perfect. I used to say I like to use crummy photos, but you know, they're not all crummy, but they're not always going to be perfect. There's going to have to be some changes that I make so that I have a better or more interesting painting. And I personally like to work from photos that are not perfect National Geographic quality, because that gives me permission to make them into better paintings. If I were painting from a wonderful, perfect photo, you know, it would be really hard to make that better. But if I have photos that have things that could be done differently or better, then it gives me more freedom, and it's a much more relaxing approach. I don't have as much pressure to perform when my photo is not perfect. So I have a photo here of a pond with reflection and some really wonderful pond scum on it. And it's got a lot of good bones, but there are a few things that I want to do to change it. One of the things, though, that I like to say is if I have to make more than 3 major changes in a reference photo, then I'm going to choose another photo. Because then it just gets confusing and overwhelming, and there's too many things going on. So I would much rather have a photo that only needs a couple of things changed. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this reference photo and simplify it, and to just use just a few big simple shapes. What I have here, I call this my thumbnail kit. All it is a piece of mat board that I've cut out my little rectangle, and then I use an index card. Oops, I'm going to have to. The reason why I do it on an index card rather than a sketchbook is because I'm going to use this index card and actually start or block in my painting from the card. And so if it's in a sketchbook, it makes it a little bit harder to work with. So I'll take it out of the little thumbnail kit. And then what I have done is I look at this scene, and the very first thing is I ask myself why. Why am I painting this? Why am I drawn to this? What do I hope to accomplish? What story do I want to tell about this? And when I look at it, I think for the most part it's going to be about the reflection in the pond and the wonderful light that's on the pond scum and the light that's hitting the trees and the bank. That's a lot of things, right? So I have to keep it simple. You don't want your story to go in too many directions, or it's going to get confusing. So, like, sometimes I'll say, okay, just pick a word. And I'm going to just say late afternoon calm. Okay, that just popped in my mind. That's what I'm going with. I remember standing there. It was
just a little bit calm. It was a little bit of wind. I'm going to make it calmer than it was. There was actually quite a bit of wind, but I'm going to make it a little bit calmer so that I can really play with the reflection. And late afternoon kind of will encompass the feeling of warmth on the trees and on the pond scum and that kind of thing. So because it's about the reflection and it's not really about the sky was gorgeous. It was beautiful, puffy clouds. That would be another painting. I can't put it all in one painting. So I'm going to raise the horizon. I'm drawing in my big simple shapes. I don't want this tall tree to be right in the middle, so it's slightly off center. And then I've got like 2 more lower trees. But I'm going to make a change. I don't want all my trees to be lined up in a row like soldiers, so I'm actually going to create another layer of these trees. So there's another layer of trees that are behind the large trees. And then I'll just stick another smaller one just to help play and to create more depth. And it actually really is here in the photo. I'm going to just enhance it.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. Oh dear.
A little bit. Now we know that these things are being reflected in the water, and then we've got this pond scum, but I'm not going to block in the pond scum in my simplified thumbnail. The reason why is because these things are going to be small enough, thin enough, that I will be able to put them right on top of the water, and they're going to come in towards the end of the painting. So I don't really need to make room for them in this stage. I'm not going to bother with the clouds, although I may hint at a cloud, because see, there are clouds in the reflection. And then there's some branches of this tree sticking in from the left-hand side. I'm going to eliminate those. I like to call that eliminate your clutter. That's clutter to me. It doesn't need to be there. And I think that about does it for my plan. So, next thing I need to do is I need to assign each of these shapes a value. Is it going to be a dark shape? Is it going to be a light shape? Or is it somewhere in between? Middle value. And lots of times I like to just use 3 or 4 values. And I base the values on John Carlson's theory of angles. In John Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, and if you are a landscape painter and you're not familiar with this book, this is something that you should have on your reading list. But Carlson talks about how most landscapes can be simplified into just 4 values. And that's a great way to get a painting started, by having a very simple value plan. What Carlson says is that the upright planes are receiving the least amount of light. The sky is the lightest value. Well, let me start over again. I'm going backwards. There's 4 values in the landscape. The lightest value is going to be the sky. Why? Because it has the sun. It's giving off the light. Oftentimes the water reflects the sky, so it will also be a light value. The darkest values are going to be the upright planes, things like trees or buildings or the edges of rivers. They are receiving the least amount of light, so they'll be the darkest value. Anything that is a flat plane, such as an area of grass, would get a moderate amount of light, so it would be a middle light value. Things that are slanted, such as mountains or hillsides, get a little bit less light than the flat, so they would be a middle dark value. Now, I'm going over this very quickly, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but if you're not familiar with this theory of angles, be sure to check it out. It was a game changer for me once I started to incorporate this. And by the way, it's accurate. I want to say 95% of the time. There's always going to be exceptions. But once you kind of learn this idea, it's easier to spot the exceptions. And I want you, it's kind of tricky when I look at this photo and I show you what I'm going to make dark and what I'm going to make light. You may argue and say, no, that's not true. That's not what I see. But trust me on this. If we start off the painting this way, we will make changes, make adjustments to the value, to the color, to the temperature as the painting progresses. So, Carlson says, oh, by the way, I'm using these Tombow brush pens in 3 shades of gray, a dark, a middle, and a light. All right. Carlson says the sky is the lightest value. So I'm going to leave the sky alone. I'm not going to, let me erase that line. I'm not going to put down any marker on the sky. All right. And I'm also going to leave the water alone because it's reflecting the sky. That means that everything else is at least a middle value. At least a middle value. So that means all my trees, all this land right here, this land mass, and the reflections are going to be at least, oops, actually the distant trees are not reflected because they're too far back. All right, they're at least a middle value. So I'll take the lightest gray marker and color in everything here. Now what you want to do on this is you want to make sure you color in your shapes with big solid marks. You don't want scribbly marks because then it's really too hard to read the values. So then I say, okay, we have the light value of the sky and the water. Everything else is at least middle value. But is there anything in here that's going to be a darker value? Are there any upright planes? Well, there are. They're the trees, right? So I'm going to take the darkest marker and I'm going to block in the tree shapes. Oops. Not the distant trees, just the trees that are in the foreground. I am also going to block in the edge of the water, where the land meets the water. So then I say, okay, but you might say, but Karen, those don't look very dark. Actually, the sky looks darker than the trees in this photo. Well, that's just an... that's true because they're getting a lot of light, but trust me, and then we will gradually add the warmer light as the painting progresses. So the next thing I say is, okay, are there any slanted planes? Because slanted planes would be a little bit lighter than the upright planes. There are not slanted planes. There are no hillsides here, but we do have some distant trees. So I'm going to actually make the distant trees a little bit darker. I'm going to leave the land, this middle light value, the first one we did. And because the reflections are going to be a little bit lighter than the trees themselves, I'll just use this middle light. Yeah, this is the middle dark to do the trees. All right, let's just review this. We've got the light in the sky, the light value of the water, the dark value of the upright planes or the trees, the middle dark of the distant trees, the middle value of the land mass, and the middle dark of the reflections. This is a very simplified value map. And now I'm going to be ready to block in the painting. Typically what I'll do though is I'll decide how I'm going to block in the painting, what type of underpainting I'm going to use, and I'll get started on that, and then I'll go and select the colors or the actual pastels I'm going to use. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to get set up for the underpainting stage. All right, I'm back and I'm set up for our block in, or you might want to call it the underpainting stage. Now, before I get into what I'm going to do, I just want to preface it by saying that underpainting for pastels is a huge topic, and it is actually something that I've done 3-day workshops on. So
it's hard for me to, in a 2-hour demo that is based upon other things, to say, okay, now let's have a lesson on underpainting. But I'm going to just give a very quick overview of underpainting, and then that's something that you can dive into in greater detail, either on my blog or Patreon page, or join one of my workshops in the future, because I've got a lot to say about underpainting. First of all, underpainting does not always have to be wet. It can be dry. It can be just simply a dry wash where you rub in pastel. In fact, one of my favorite ways to block in a painting, and I'm not going to do it today because I want to have a little fun today, but my favorite, I call it a no-fail start. You choose one color family and you choose 4 pastels in that color family to match the values on your value map. And then you use that to get a kind of value underpainting or block in that has a little bit of color that kind of helps make your painting more interesting. That's my no-fail start. I love that way to start. The other way is a no-fail start is if you block in the extremes. So your darkest dark, your lightest light, your most intense color. And then you either rub that in if it's dry, or you wet it if it's a wet underpainting. So I'm going to kind of use that approach for this particular start or block in. I'm going to go for the darkest darks, lightest lights, most intense color, and you'll see where it goes from that. The other consideration we have to make is what type of underpainting do we want? Do we want a dry underpainting? Do we want it to be wet and drippy? I mean, we can wet pastel with water or alcohol, odorless mineral spirits, or we could use other media such as acrylic or oil or ink. Pretty much you name it, as long as it's thin enough, you can use it to start a painting. What we're going to do today, so I want to invite you a little bit closer, we're going to be doing a wet underpainting using these Derwent Inktense blocks. They are ink blocks. I believe they come in a bigger set, which I really want to order because I've been using this block-in method or underpainting method a lot lately, and I really do enjoy it. The colors are so vibrant and so intense, ink-tense, that they really make wonderful underpaintings. They're funny. They look like they would be a hard pastel, such as a new pastel, but they're actually kind of waxy, but because they're ink, and as soon as you wet them, they just explode into wonderful color. So that's what I'm going to be using for our underpainting today. The paper that I'm using, and this is 11 by 14, is Lux Archival sanded paper, and I started using this several months ago, and I fell in love with it because it does not buckle or wave or do anything other than lay flat when you get it wet, and I have really put it to the test. You do not have to pre-mount it. Some sanded papers do better when they're mounted. This one you don't have to do. It's fairly thick. I do want to show you how I attach my paper to my board, because this is a question I get a lot. This is, by the way, an inexpensive piece of foam core from the Dollar Tree, so $1. Made in USA though. And I attach my paper by using tape hinges made out of artist tape. So I actually put the tape sticky side up and then tape it down. And I typically will tape the 4 corners and sometimes in the middle, but mostly the 4 corners. I like this method because I can easily remove my paper from the tape hinges, and I can reuse those until they're no longer sticky. So I'm not using a whole lot of tape. It's just a minimum amount of tape, just the minimum amount that I actually need. So it works really well. Why am I working on black? I get that question a lot, rather than white foam core. And simply, it's so that you can see it better in the video. And sometimes I'll draw things or I'll write down notes, kind of like a chalkboard, so that it's just a good teaching tool. That's really the only reason why I use black versus the white foam core. All right.
So what we're going to do is I'm going to now just kind of look at my photo briefly so I can kind of get an idea of the colors. And then I'm going to put it aside. I don't want to look at the photo when I'm blocking in the painting because I will tend to get too caught up in all the details, because I'll see the details in the photo and before you know it I'll be putting in the pond scum and tree trunks. I don't want to do that at this stage in the painting. I want to have a strong, simple foundation, and I will gradually add the detail and the clarity where I want you to look. I'm going to create a visual journey for the viewer. I want the viewer's eye to move into the painting and around the painting so that the viewer enjoys all parts of the painting. And I can do this by having a strong, simple start and then deciding where I want to put the focus and the clarity. So I'm going to look at
Wait a minute. Shoot. Oh. Can anybody hear me? I'm sharing my screen.
Yes, I can hear you.
Now I can hear you too. Let me hear the message here.
Yeah, we can hear you too. We can hear you.
Great. I just wanted to check in, see how everybody's doing. Does anybody need a little break? No takers? Then I'm going to go back to screen sharing unless somebody stops me. 1, 2, 3, here we go. Oh no, wait a minute. I'll get this in a minute.
the thumbnail. So remember, we had a high horizon. Oh, by the way, I'm using just a number 2 pencil, and I'm going to put it in very lightly. This is the little bit of landmass. One thing that I'm going to probably change right now, I'm going to stick the land and make a little jog of water in there. The reason why is I don't want the land to look like a big worm shape going across my paper. I'll talk more about that as we go on. So then we've got our tall tree slightly off center, and then we have our other tree shapes. I don't want them all the same. I'll change them up a little bit. Remember, you want interesting shapes. And then we have our smaller tree right there. And then we have our tree line in the distance, right here. Now we know that these guys are going to be reflected, and this is going to be a little bit longer, and this guy's reflected. What about all this pond scum? We're going to get to it. I don't have to really put it in right now. And clouds, we're not worried about. Do I want this tree to go? I'm going to have it go off the page. The reason why is I had it so close to the top, it's kissing the top, and it just would look awkward. So either bring it down lower, maybe I'll bring it down lower. I can decide about that. I'm going to either bring it down lower or pull it all the way off the paper, but I had it too close to the edge. All right, now we're going to start to apply our ink tints, our colors. So we want to block in the darkest darks first. So remember, the darkest darks, we can look at our thumbnail for a hint. Those are going to be the trees, the uprights. So I'm going to block those in with a dark blue ink tints. Now remember, I wanted to have the bank, but I don't want worms. So a worm is anything you have a hard-edged, dark, kind of linear shape or light linear shape, but the edges are hard and it creates a visual barrier. You can't move past it. So if you have a bank or a shadow under trees and you make it a hard edge shape that goes like all the way across your painting, that's what I would consider a worm, and we don't want worms. Worms we're going to chop up. So you got to be careful of that. Now, here's a trick. I don't know if you can call it a trick, but a thing to keep in mind when you're painting reflections. If I'm going to put it above the water, if it's something that's above the water line and it's being reflected, I'm going to carry it down in the water. But the difference is I might use kind of a random strokes in the trees above the water, but anytime it's a reflection that goes in the water, I'm going to use vertical strokes, so up and down. I'm not going to do, scribble scrabble, because it will look like upside down trees. You don't want that. You want it to look like a reflection. All right, so that's our darkest shape, our darkest values. Then we're going to move on to the lightest values. The lightest values, as you recall, was the sky and the water. Now, I'm going to use the local color of blue to paint or to block in the sky. Now, I will tell you right now that it is already much darker than I really want it to be, but that happens to be the lightest blue that I have in this set. I can try to lighten it. I'm going to add a little bit of white on top so that I can maybe hopefully get a lighter value, but it may be still too dark, and if that's the case when I add pastel, I'll keep that in mind that I want to keep it lighter. We have our water that's also going to be this blue. Now watch what I'm doing. This is key for reflections. I'm using horizontal strokes to put in the water, right? Actually, the foreground water is actually going to be darker because it reflects a darker portion of the sky. So I'm not going to add the white to that part right there. Oh, it jumped out of my hand. All right, so where are we? We have our darkest dark, our lightest light, now our most intense color. Now, if you remember from the photo, and I'll just pull the photo out just to remind you, what is the most intense color? Probably this really kind of chartreusey green, golden yellow. See it? See it? All the golden green yellows of the pond scum. So I'm going to take this chartreusey greenish yellow, and what is this? This one's a little bit of a darker value. This is good pond scum color. Now I'm going to throw a little bit of this into the water. Now you remember I have mentioned that I'm not going to put the pond scum until the end, but it's not going to hurt to have a little hint of that color down there. Here's a little, let's add a little bit of green to this. All right, what is left? Darkest dark, lightest light, most intense color, and then everything else that I haven't colored in will be a middle value of some kind. So I've got distant trees, so I know that they need to be lighter and cooler than these foreground trees. So I'm going to actually use a blue, a little bit darker than the sky, for these distant trees, and I'm going to do something else. I'm going to add some green, dark green, to our foreground trees. This is a warmer color than the blue, right? So they'll come forward and the blue will go back. Now remember, if I put a color above the water in the anything that's above the water, I'm going to add that color down below, but I'm going to use up and down, vertical strokes for the reflection, horizontal strokes for the water. And something just told me I need to darken the green stuff in the water. And if ever something tells you to do something, for some reason you feel like, oh, I think I need to do something tells me I need to add purple, or I need to change something, I always go ahead and listen, because a lot of times when I listen to what my inner voice is telling me, it works out. So my inner voice told me, why not add a little bit of light to the trees at this stage? Because, you know, what you're doing in the underpainting is going to help you with the pastel application. So I look at my photo once again and I realize that the sunlight is coming from the left. It's illuminating the left-hand side of the trees. So I added a warmer, lighter yellow-green to the left-hand side of the trees, and I also put it down in the water. So I think that I have everything covered in my underpainting. I do think I'm going to add a little dark violet to the base of these trees and add a few indications of some tree trunks. Got to put it down in the water, and a little bit along the bank. The main reason for doing this is I want to have nice grounded trees, and purple, when in doubt, I like to say, when in doubt, use a little purple, because purple never hurts, it only helps. I'll add a little red violet in there too, just to add a little interest in color, because I really don't want this painting to be all blue and green. That would be boring. So that is my application of the Inktense. The next part of this underpainting process is to liquefy all of that with a little bit of water. And I'm going to use water. You can use rubbing alcohol, you can use odorless mineral spirits, but it's just simple to add water. And sometimes I find that the water actually is a little bit even more intense than the other liquids. I'm going to be using a cheap brush. This is actually a child's paintbrush from Princeton Brushes, and I find this to work really well for underpainting because they're inexpensive, so you don't mind if the sanded paper kind of destroys them after a while. And I just like a nice stiff brush because I really like to push the paint in. If you use a very soft brush, you're going to get a totally different effect. Oh, speaking of that, one thing I wanted to say about underpaintings, because I get this question all the time. How do I know what colors to choose for my underpainting? Or how do I know what type of underpainting I should do? And my quick answer is, you're in luck, because there's no right answer or no wrong answer. Every choice you make is valid, and it's going to give you a different result. How do you know which one to use? That's the tricky part, and that's the part that takes time, because it just takes practice and experience. The more underpaintings you do and experiment with, the more knowledge you're feeding your brain, and the more you're able to make more intuitive choices. I like to say, if there was a formula and I could answer that question, I would have done so in a book or a video, and you would have that information, but there's not. So just have fun, and that's what I like to do. So I'm going to wet it with a little water. I'm going to use a paper towel just so that I don't have it too wet and drippy. I don't mind drips, but I want to kind of have a little bit of control over the drips in the early stages. So I'm going to start with the lightest value first, and I'm going to wet it. And one thing that I want to say about doing this wet underpainting is take your time. You are not going to be a house painter, meaning you're not going to just go from top to bottom. You know, you have a brush in your hand, and what you want to do is utilize the brush and pretend that you're actually doing a wet or liquid painting. The slower you go, the more thoughtful you are about this process, the easier the pastel application will be. Let this underpainting do a lot of the work for you. So I used to be a house painter. Not really. I hate to house paint. I used to be a house painter when I did underpaintings, meaning I would just like rush. Okay, let's get it wet. Let's move on. I want to do pastel. And what I realized was I was doing myself a disservice because I wasn't spending enough time being thoughtful. And what do I mean by that? Well, for example, the sky. What? Mindful? The sky, I did kind of random brush strokes. But now when I paint the water, I need to be sure I use the horizontal brush strokes because I want to give myself a head start into this feeling of the wateriness of it all. Right? So I think about the type of brush strokes I'm using. And that's my dog Heidi. And alright, so I did the lightest. Now I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do the landmass. Sometimes if you start with the darks first, you can easily contaminate your brush and water, and you're going to have to change out your water, and it'll slow you down. So if you start with the lighter colors first, then move into the darkest colors, then I think it's a lot easier. The next lightest is going to be this pond scum. Again, horizontal strokes down here in the water. And I don't mind if things start to drip and dribble and blur into the other color. That's the beauty of a wet underpainting, that you can end up with unexpected color, unexpected drips and kind of blooms, and all of these will play into having perhaps a more interesting painting. All right, let's see, let's do our distant trees. So these are going to be in kind of random brush strokes. That blue color kind of looks like it could be something wrong with the sky. We're not going to keep it that blue when I start layering pastel, but it'll give me a good reminder that I want to create a believable feeling of depth. By the way, at the end of this demo, I'm going to go over my punch list for what makes how I evaluate my painting to see if it's successful, to see if I'm meeting my goals. And I'll talk about 3 things that I look for that are key to helping me have a successful painting. Right now I'm going to move into my bigger trees, my darker trees. And these again are a little more randomized brush strokes. These tree shapes right now in this underpainting, I definitely admit they are not interesting shapes. They're kind of blobby. But I know that they form a good foundation for what's to come. And I will make them into more interesting shapes as my painting progresses. Now, here's the important part. I'm going to paint these reflected areas, and what am I going to do? I'm going to use these vertical brush strokes. So up and down. I might even make them a little bit wetter so that they drip, so that they really look watery. Also, when you're painting reflections, here's just a tip for reflections. That's a little bit too much. A lot of times when you make changes from your reference photo, you know, you move a tree, you put it in a different place. Be very careful that your reflections match what you've created and not necessarily what's on your reference photo. So that makes sense. If I moved a tree over and then I'm looking at my reference photo and I put the reflection where it's in the photo but not where the tree really is, then you're not being accurate. All right, so I've got everything wet now. We have to let things dry. As it dries, you're going to get some more dribbles. You're going to get some interesting spider web effects. Look at these cool things here. It's one of the things that I love about wet underpaintings is we can't predict what's going to happen, but we often get some unexpected things that actually could be really cool. Sometimes, I will say this, nothing happens. And you're like, why did I bother? It's nothing. But then other times you get some really exciting things. Look at these cool spider webs. Really exciting, and it makes you really excited to get in there with the pastel. But what we have to do now is we have to let this underpainting dry completely. You know, if you're in a hurry and you're in the studio, you have a hairdryer, you could certainly, you know, put a hairdryer on it and dry it more quickly. But what I'd like to do normally is use this time to help me select the pastels I'm going to use for the painting. So that's what we'll do now. All right, it is almost dry. We have just a couple of spots. I'm going to let that dry. And I want to talk to you about something that I'm going to keep in mind as I start my pastel application. Now, we talked earlier about the importance of having a good design, a good value plan, and a good plan for color. So let's talk a little bit more about the design. My overall goal for this painting, when I'm thinking about the composition or the design, is I want to create a visual journey for the viewer. In other words, I want the viewer to know where I want them to look. I want to show them around the painting. I want there to be areas of interest that will hold their attention for a little bit, but then something else that might pull them further along into the painting. And we can do this a couple different ways. We can use actual pathways, so that's why in landscape paintings many times we use roads or pathways or waterways to create that visual pathway. Natural or man-made roads or actual pathways that are natural ways to pull the viewer into the painting. But we can also create implied pathways. That is, when we don't have a real physical path, we can create what I like to call stepping stones, or you might even consider them breadcrumbs, that draw you into the painting, that you follow. And what are these stepping stones? They are areas of contrast that attract your eye. Because we know that our eye is drawn to contrast. So a light area against a dark area, a warm against a cool, a hard edge against a soft edge, an intense color against a dull color, a thicker application of pastel against a thinner application. These are all areas of contrast, and we can use these to pull the eye around the painting. Now, we have to also be careful of creating contrast where we don't want the viewer's eye to look. And so what I'm going to be doing as I add the pastel to this painting is keeping the viewer in mind. How is the viewer looking at the painting? Where is the eye going to? And where I want the eye to go is where I'll put the most detail and the most contrast. So we'll revisit this as we get towards the end of the painting. All right, so here we go. We have our underpainting. It's now dry. You can see, that's the dog. Maybe she's itchy. Maybe she'll stop. If not, we'll have to stop the video for a minute. Give her a second. This is Heidi. You know, we used to keep Heidi upstairs because she would make all kinds of noises, and she'd bark at me because she was thinking I was talking to her. And she's gotten over that, but if she's itchy, all right, let's stop for a minute. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that, guys.
Dogs.
She wasn't going to cooperate. So, anyways, all right. So here we are, perfectly flat. I love this Lux Archival sanded paper. I didn't even have to worry about it buckling or getting wavy. And you saw that I used quite a bit of water. I was very liberal with the water, and that was good. So now it's time to put the pastel on the painting. And we can see we have a very good value map of darks and lights and middle values. We have an indication of the way we're going with color. And so what we're going to do is start to gradually add more and more detail till we get to the level of detail that we're comfortable with. I want to share with you the pastels that I'm going to be using. This is the Floral Landscape set of Terry Ludwig pastels. And I put this set together because these were the pastels that I found that I was using more often than any others. It has a very good variety of value, lights and darks and middle values, some pure intense bright colors, as well as some duller colors. Now I'm going to start by using this set, but it may be as I get towards the very end of the painting, I will use some hard pastels for detail, and I might even go to a softer pastel for some of those finishing marks. But this is going to be a good place to start. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at this underpainting and ask myself, is there anything here that I really want to preserve, that I like what happened in the underpainting, so I want to make sure I keep it. And when that happens, if there is something, then normally what I do is I just kind of make a mental note to use a very light touch when I come in with pastel. That way I can preserve some of that underpainting. By going in too quickly and too heavily, then we kind of ruin the underpainting, and so I want to have a very light touch. The other thing that I like to do sometimes is try to match the color and value of my pastel to the underpainting color, and that also helps me preserve the underpainting. So I'm going to first start by reinforcing the dark values. What I'm going to do now, though, is I'm going to take away the little thumbnail sketch. We don't need that anymore, and I'm going to be working from the photo. So I'll move it a little bit closer so you guys can see it. And I'm going to take a dark blue pastel, and I'm going to very lightly reinforce the darker values, so the shadowed side of the trees. Now remember, I mentioned to you that I didn't feel like these tree shapes were all that interesting, so we're going to make some changes or alter their shapes to make them more interesting as this painting progresses. And I think I ended up making it taller. Remember, I couldn't decide? I think I'm going to make it taller. Alright, so if it's something that's above the water, I'm going to be putting it down into the water. So I'm going to add a little bit of this dark blue down into the water, and a little bit along the edge of the... Remember, I wanted to have a little bit of water peek in here. We'll see how that goes. I'm not sure if that's going to work out. Alright, so we have one layer of dark pastel. Now, the one thing that I like to do, this is a personal thing for me, is I like to build up multiple layers of color within each value shape. So if I have a dark value, I look at the tree and I say, well, you know, that's dark green. Why not just use dark green? Well, to me, that would not be as interesting as if I could layer multiple colors of the same value. So I'm going to take a dark burgundy and lightly layer it over the dark blue. And the reason why I'm doing this is so that I can have a more interesting collection of color within each value shape. I also know that if I have a lot of green, which this painting has a lot of green, that oftentimes if you make things too green, they're not going to look alive. They're not going to look like they're filled with light. So by adding other colors, especially these warmer colors, I just added a red, now I'm adding a red-violet, then I'm adding these warmer colors, and when they play with the cool greens, it really feels much more lively. But now I have 3 layers of dark, right? So I have a dark blue, a dark red, and a dark purple. These are, after all, dark green, or green trees. So I do need to add a little bit of green. So I'm coming in with a dark value green as the last layer in these trees. Now, again, I have to remember to put it in the water. If I put it above the water, no, that one goes a little bit lower. I want to keep, I'm adding a little bit of a cooler dark green. This is more of a blue green, just for the shadowed areas. And I'm using a very light touch. How do I know if my touch is light enough? If I can still see the layers underneath, so I can still see the red, the purple, the green, the blue, even some of the underpainting, then I know it's light enough. In this area here, I can no.
Sorry, folks, we're going to add somebody in. Dispense. Okay. Screen share. Am I still screen sharing?
See anything, then perhaps I've pressed a little too hard. So I want to keep things light so I can see all those layers interacting with one another. I call this whispering. I like to whisper for as long as I can. When I get towards the end of a painting, or when I get to an area of a painting that I know I'm not going to change, then I will shout, meaning I will press down much harder so that you can see a firmer mark and you can't see what's underneath. So a combination of whispering and shouting is what's going to give you that nice contrast that we're looking for. All right, so now we've blocked in all of the dark areas. I have several ways I can go with this painting. I can really refine the trees and add the light, and get them more finished. Or what I like to do is work on the sky and the background and then continue working my way down. I do this for a couple of reasons. One, it's important to note that the sky is the provider of light, right? So it sets the whole mood and tone of the painting. Is this going to be a happy blue sky day? Is it going to be a moody day, right? So is it going to be dark and stormy, or is it going to be bright? So by establishing what type of day it is, what type of sky I'm working with early on in the painting, it really sets the whole mood for the entire painting. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take several blue pastels. So I started with a little bit of a cooler blue, a little bit darker. Remember I said I thought that my sky might be a little too dark. So I'm lightening up a little bit, and I'm letting those layers kind of gently mix together, because I'm not showing a huge part of the sky. I'm not going to get involved with playing with clouds, and doing a lot of detail in the sky. I don't want to do that because really the sky in this painting is not the most important thing, right? We're the most important thing in this particular painting, the thing that I was most drawn to was the light on the trees, but also the reflections. So I'm taking several blue that are very similar in value, just a little bit lighter than the first layer. A blue violet, a blue, and a kind of a pale blue green. And I'm just kind of letting them mingle together so I have like a fractured sky, a sky that has a little bit more life. If I had just taken a deep blue that I see in the photo, ooh, I just smudged and just made it just like I see it in the photo, it would look flat. It wouldn't look like air. Now, I know that the sky is going to get a little bit lighter and warmer as it comes towards the horizon, but I want to establish these distant trees before I go any further. So I'm going to take let's try this one. I'm going to take a blue-green, kind of a gray down blue-gray I meant to say, and very lightly go over that underpainting. I really ended up liking the blue, that shade of blue that was in the underpainting. So I want some of it to peek through. I need to leave a little bit of room for some trunks, tree trunks. So I'm creating some negative painting, or sky holes, or tree holes, whatever you want to call them. But I know that these distant trees have to be a little bit lighter, or cooler, duller, and fuzzier, less detailed. So that way they will kind of slip back into space and they won't jump forward. Another layer of kind of a gray down, blue grayish green, just to help push those trees back into the distance. I'm going to take a pale yellow and now add it to the area of the sky that meets those distant trees. And I'm going to pull it up a little bit further into the sky so that I don't have a parfait or stripes of color in the sky. I want there to be a smooth transition of all the colors that I've used, but I want a nice lighter but yet warmer color to come down and meet the distant tree line. And I'm using this lighter pale yellow to carve out spaces so that I have an interesting silhouette in those distant trees. And by the way, you may notice, or I don't know if you can tell, I'm hardly looking at my reference photo. And the reason why is because the reference photo, as I said earlier when I first started talking, the reference photo really only serves to remind me of the place, to kind of jumpstart my memory and give me ideas. But ultimately, I want to interpret the photo using my memory, using my own ideas, and also the painting itself will start to take on a life of its own and will often kind of guide you. And so, like, I'm not looking at these trees so that I can copy them exactly. I just want to make sure the trees that are in this photo are interesting, that they have interesting shapes and interesting negative spaces and that kind of thing. Sky holes so that they don't look like big blobs. And for sky holes, for example, I will put a little mark of sky in, and then I'll tap it gently with my finger, kind of just to disguise it so that it looks a little bit fuzzy, softer edge, so that it looks like there's really holes in the trees and not Christmas ornaments on top of the trees. All right, so where are we at now with the painting? We've got our darks blocked in. We've done our light sky. And by the way, the colors that I'm going to use, or that I used in the sky, I will end up using also in the water. So I'll revisit those pastels. I've done my distant trees. I've got my reflection started. So the next order of business is to develop the light on these trees. So we remember that the light was coming from the left-hand side, so that the left-hand side of the trees are going to get some sunlight. I'm going to do something before I add any more pastel. I'm going to take a little bit of workable fixative, and I like to use Blair very low odor workable fixative, and I'm going to very lightly spray the trees and the reflections with the workable fixative. And I'm doing this for two reasons. Number one, I really want to kind of cement these darks into place so that they don't really contaminate my lighter layers. Even though I use a light touch, it can still happen. But the other reason why I like this workable fixative is, for some reason, it gives me a feeling of texture. When you add pastel on top of layers that have been fixed with certain workable fixative, and I find the Blair works really well, you're going to get this kind of feeling of texture as the pastel skips over the darkened areas. So I'm going in, and what I like to say is I'm gradually going to turn on the lights. Gradually turn on the lights. So I'm not going to jump right away to the very lightest or warmest yellow-green like I see in the photo. But I'm going to take baby steps, and I'm going with a pretty dark yellow-green, like almost as dark as the darkest areas. Remember though, if you put it above the water, make sure you pull it down into the water. And now I'm going to step it up a little bit with a little bit of a lighter yellow-green. Now the thing is, you don't want to put it everywhere, because if you put it everywhere, you're going to flatten out your tree shapes. So look at your trees and try to determine what part of the trees are sticking out enough that they're getting that warm sunlight on them. Some areas are sticking out more than others. Sometimes I will add more than one layer of fixative, because then I get even more texture. And one thing that I forgot to do is pull that last pastel down into the water. Can you start to see how already these vertical strokes contrasting with these kind of bushy strokes, I don't know what else to call it, how that starts to look more watery or wet? That's because I'm not copying the same marks when I go into the water, and it makes a big difference. Let's go even lighter. And brighter. This is a really kind of intense yellow-green. And remember, if you put it everywhere, you're going to flatten out your tree shapes. And there are some other little trees that I feel like, just to fill in, they're not getting quite as much light, so I'm not going to use that yellowy green. I'm going to use more of a grass green. But they're further back, so they're not going to appear in the reflection. Oops, what did I forget? I didn't put it down in the water. Here we go. Okay. Now, are my trees fluffy enough? I think I'm going to stop. I find sometimes that, and we all do it from time to time, we get fixated on an area of a painting, right? And we're like, oh, I don't know, should I add more? Should I take away some? And I don't like what's happening here. And we spend so much time in one area that we lose sight of what's really happening in the painting. And if we would just step back we could tell ourselves, you know what, it's actually doesn't need any more. Move away from that area. Focus on somewhere else. And I think when we allow ourselves to do that, we have a little bit more success. I'm adding now with the side of the pastel some pale peach to give some sunlight trunks, and then some darker blue to kind of give some of those tree trunks that are in the shade or in the shadows. And I am going to, at this point, stop with the trees. Oh, if they were reflected, I mean, if those tree trunks were above the water, shouldn't we see them in the water? Perhaps. So I'm going to pull them in the water. Okay. Now, where are we at? We've got our sky, we've got our trees, we have our distant trees, we have our reflections, we need our landmass and our bank, and then we can do the water, and then finally that pond scum. So, let's work on this landmass. Now remember, we put in this really bright color in the underpainting. And that was the most intense color, right? That really bright green. I really like the way it looks. And that's the time when the underpainting really kind of can guide you in one way or another. But I want to create a little bit more feeling of depth in this area. I don't want there just to be a strip of bright green. So what I'm going to do is take this kind of dullish grayed down green and stick it back, make a few little marks in the kind of behind some of these trees. I don't know how to explain it. This is a color, it's kind of a neutral, so it could kind of sit in the background just a little bit, and it can create, I'm just putting little tiny pieces of it in and around the trees so that the trees look kind of staggered instead of all in a straight line. I think I need to add, let's go ahead and add a little bit of pale peach, a very light layer on top of this bright green. The reason why I'm doing this, I'm going to call this the dirt color, is because I want there to be a little bit of color underneath that bright green. Like the dirt would be a different color, and it would give a little bit of warmth to this distant bank. And now I can come in with the brighter green, yellow green, very lightly. Because I like what's happening with the underpainting. Underpainting was kind of interesting, the different colors and the drips, so I don't want to get too carried away in here. Now I'm going to revisit this area because remember, what was my goal? I want to create visual pathways. I need to give stepping stones for the viewer, but a lot of times those are going to be the final marks or the finishing marks, and we'll come back to those. Alright, one other thing we need to do before we move on to the water is we need to really kind of reinforce where the bank kind of jogs in there meets the water. So I'm using the darkest pastel I have in this set, which is, if you guys are familiar with the Terry Ludwig eggplant pastel, I call it a super dark. I'm putting in little bits and pieces of it. I don't want it all the way across like a line because it would be a worm, right? And we don't want worms, right? Worms are not interesting. I'm also taking this super dark and I'm adding it just a little bit to the base of these two main trees. All right. The reason I don't want it everywhere, because remember, if it's everywhere, it loses its impact. Anything that is good, that is working, we are tempted to just add more of it. And a lot of times then that takes away the whole impact of it. So just because it's good doesn't mean we need a lot of it. Try to have some restraint. Okay, so I'm going to come back in just a minute and we're going to finish up with the water. All right, so we are getting to the fun part, the water. A couple of things that we're going to do. First things first is we're going to smudge the reflections. Now, I don't usually like to do too much blending with fingers. It's a sure way to create dull, muddy color because we're crushing the crystals and the pastel, and we are physically blending layers together, and those things can create dull, muddy passages. But in this case,
Sorry, folks. We want to let Helen in. Come up here.
by blending, and notice I blended in a vertical fashion, like pulling these reflections down into the water, it starts looking watery. It's getting exciting. So now we're going to come back and paint the water, but we're going to paint the water with horizontal marks. Now, one thing about the water or reflections is typically your here's what I like to do. I like to take what's above the water and mentally in my mind flip it down over the water. What is above this water is reflected down below. Now, if I only have this much sky, these colors are only going to go this far. Beyond would be more sky. And the clue here is that the sky is deeper, darker, and there are actually some clouds. I'm not sure if I'm going to put the clouds in the reflection. We'll see. We're going to play that by ear. But I do know that what's in the foreground is going to reflect the higher part of the sky, so it's typically going to be darker. So I'm going to take a darker blue for this area and very, very lightly do some horizontal strokes in this foreground part of the water. Now, what about that pond scum? Remember, we put some of those colors down in the water, those really nice yellow greens. So I want some of them to peek through, because I'm going to paint some of them, but I want to only suggest some of the other ones. Now, as I come up closer to the bank, I'm going to use a little bit of a lighter value blue. Now, what about this area that goes over the reflection? I'm going to very, very lightly pull my blue pastel over that reflected tree. Like so, super soft. And if you find that you are an artist that typically has a heavy touch, you might want to practice when you do the reflections, because it has to be a whisper. Because if you don't whisper over it, you don't get the same effect. Alright, and as I come closer to the bank, I'm going to get even lighter. And I'm going to look at my painting, not the photo, to where I want to make sure I have, I'm going to press a little bit harder, where the sky kind of peeks in. So we have a little bit of sky coming down in here between these two trees. The sky comes down in here between these two trees. And then right over in here. Now, I've left a lot of this peeking through, and I've done that on purpose because I'm going to come in on top with some of that pond scum. Super light touch. Now, a lot of times you can get it right the first time. Pull the reflections down, lightly pull the water on top, and you get a feeling of the wateriness right away. Sometimes I'm not as successful and I'll just go back and start over. Pull down the reflection.
Oh no. What? Do you believe that? Come on. Go. Wait, let me just make sure everybody's here. All right. Jeez. Sorry.
Blend them in and come back on top with the water. But I find if I use a light enough touch early on, then I have more success. So really, I can't stress enough how important the light touch is. Oh, I want to point out something in my photo. Notice how the bank pond scum is algae. My helper husband is telling me, yeah, pond scum. But my friends and I, we love pond scum, so that's what we call it. But notice how the bank kind of curves around because it was a small pond. If I were to do that, if I were to make mine curve like that, it might look a little, it wouldn't look like the water was being held in a little bit. So here's what you want to do to deal with a curving, I'm going to just do it in here just to show you, a curving pond. You want to do it in stair steps. So you want to just kind of, oops, do it in straight lines rather than a curve. So create your curve using straight lines. Straight line, straight line, straight line, till you get the curve, and that's going to be more effective than if you were to just draw it a curve. It just wouldn't look as natural. Okay, so now we're going to come in and do a little bit more with the pond scum, and I kind of like this yellow, golden ochre yellow. I'm going to just come in and put in some of these. This is darker. I'll put a couple in over here. Some of them are in the shadow, right? And some of them are really catching the light. So, and I don't want to have too many little tiny pieces of little pond scum stuff. Oh, I just want to, now I'm starting to shout. So where I want to put some lighter ones, like that are coming into the light, I'm pressing much harder. And I'm making smaller, kind of messy little chunky marks, like so. There's some of that pond scum in the distance too, but I don't want to use the same color. So I'll use this yellow ochre color. And I'm going to make, because they're further back, they're going to be closer together, kind of stacked up, and they're going to be smaller little marks. So fatter marks, and then smaller marks that are stacked on top of one another to kind of indicate that they are back in the distance. There's some of them over here. We can put a couple over here. Now I think we can actually make these a little bit brighter, the ones that are really catching the sunlight. Now, I'm going to stop right now because now I'm to the point where I'm making the finishing marks, okay? So what I want to do before I go any further, I'm starting to get into it, and what happens oftentimes, we get to the end of a painting and we are excited about it, or we're just not thinking anymore, because we've been painting with passion and intuition, and now if we don't slow down, we might end up overworking the painting and putting down marks where we don't need them, ruining any freshness that we might have. So this is the part in every painting where I always advise students and myself to step away, take a break, go get a drink, do what you do to relax, come back to the painting with fresh eyes, and when you come back with fresh eyes, come back with your punch list. All right, so I'm going to just take a quick break, and I will be back with the punch list, and we'll go over it, and then we're going to finish the painting. All right, I come back to the painting, and I go over my punch list. So these are the questions I ask myself, and then as I ask them, what I typically will do is write down. I have a dry erase board. I get this at the Dollar Tree, and I write down on this dry erase board the things that I want to adjust. Then, and only then, will I pick up a pastel and make those adjustments. And I'll just kind of go off the list. This prevents me from overworking and painting on areas that really don't need anything. And also, I remember what I...
Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. Yep.
I just wanted to find out if anybody needs a break. You want to get up and move around a little bit? Okay, nobody
I would
does.
like to
Maybe
see her painting punch list. I can't see it clearly.
Oh, okay. I think it'll be bigger when I continue.
I
Okay.
think the goal is to listen to the program without interruption.
Plunge down to the front heel.
Without a what?
Without any interruptions.
Front leg,
Sorry. All right.
flat back, straight leg.
wanted to fix. So here's what I'm going to look for. Is there a visual journey for the viewer? Are there visual pathways with areas of interest that take a viewer around the painting? Are there areas of contrast helping or hindering the journey?
Hit.
Is there a believable feeling of depth in the painting? Is there an earth-sky connection? Meaning, is there a relationship between what's happening in the sky, what's happening on the ground or in the water? Are there unintended pathways or worms or
Sorry,
friendly
folks. Would you mute yourselves?
The line. Let me know. Put it in the
Everybody, mute yourselves. We're getting a lot of background noise. Here we go. By the way, we're going to make this available to you afterwards, so you can go back and watch it and go backwards and forwards and take notes again if you'd like. Here we go.
tangents, or anything that is distracting or that takes the viewer's eye out of the painting too quickly. All right, so number one, visual journey. That means, where does the eye go? I want to pull the eye into the painting, so I can do that by adding more light, stronger marks on some of these areas of pond scum or algae. But I don't want your eye to stop right there, you see? Because if all these interesting things are right here, how am I going to get you from here to back here? So somehow I need to do something to kind of pull the eye over here, and then maybe over here again, and then I want you to enjoy these trees before you exit the painting. Okay, so those are the things I'm going to do. I'm going to leave a lot of this out of focus and only show a few in focus or that have clarity. Work on getting some interest over here, perhaps over here, and then clarify or refine some of the trees in this area. This is going to be my main area. That'll be secondary, secondary, secondary. So I want you to go here, here, and here, and out the painting. That's what I'm going to try to do. Is there a believable feeling of depth in the painting? I've got the lighter, cooler, duller, fuzzier trees, warmer trees in the foreground, more detail in the foreground. Things are getting smaller, less detailed as you go back. So I think that's working. Earth-sky connection. I've got same colors that are repeated down here. I think I could maybe add a little bit of that lighter colored in here. Maybe I want a hint of a cloud. Maybe that's what's going to help this area. And then we'll check for unintended pathways and worms and things like that. All right, so here we go. Oops. Let's come in. And I started, before I took that break, I was starting to add a little bit of brighter light and more clarity to some of the scum in here. think what I can do is maybe move a couple of them up into this middle area just a little bit, and then hit it with that lighter color. So that's kind of breaking up this whole line, and I might add a little bit of light on some of them right down in here. So it's catching a little bit of light, so it's pulling us up into this area. And let's see, we're going to add a little bit of light down in here. What if we kind of hinted at this to be a cloud shape? And so then that way the cloud shape would actually be right in this area, like so. So now we've got a little bit more interest going on in this area. So now I want to bring the viewer's attention up to this section of the painting. So I've got these little pieces of the pond scum that are closer together, but what if I, let's see, just need to kind of get you to come over here a little bit more. So instead of having a line, okay, that I feel like I made too thick. What happens if you make something too thick? You could brush it away, but I'm going to take a pin, a steel tip pin, like so, and scrape away the pastel I don't want. And I have a little bit more precision, okay, so that works a little bit better sometimes. Alright, so we've got that going over here. How are we going to get you over into the trees? I think one thing we can do is we can add a stronger mark of light right in our big focal area, right in here. It's just I'm pressing a lot harder, so it's a thicker mark. And I can add just a few hints of foliage. So I'm making a few smaller, call them leaf marks, just so that you can kind of see this tree has a little bit more detail, so it attracts more attention than the other tree, because we can actually see what's going on. Let's give it a little bit of light. A couple of lighter little floats of leaves over in here, just to kind of say, hey, come on, come look at us. We have more detail, more clarity. And by the way, when you're doing this part of the painting, let's hit these with a little bit of that light. Typically what I do when I'm not doing a demo is I'll make a mark or two and then I'll step back. Make a mark or two and then I'll step back. I think I need to put a couple in here so I can bridge this gap, right? So we can go like this, over here, up in here, and then back out the painting. I think I'm going to just a touch more purple in that area, especially up against that bright yellow-green, because that is a nice complementary pair, and it kind of makes an interesting mark right in there. And I think one other thing, that's the darkest blue that I have. I almost think I would like it to be even darker, right down in the foreground. The last thing that I'm going to do is I want to make sure you or the viewer knows that this is water and this is land and this is the bank. So one of the things that is a little kind of trick, I guess you could say, to help you realize it's water is to create some current lines. So one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a hard pastel. I've just pulled out some new pastels, so it's a harder pastel stick. And I've got the sharp edge, and I'm just putting little tiny hints of some linear marks up against the bank where the water hits the bank, kind of like where the wind might pick up a little bit of the water and show us kind of a wave action, if you will. I'm also going to take that same, the pale blue, and kind of make some linear marks. And create some of those current lines. If you get too many, you might want to come in with your finger and press it down a little bit longer, a little bit. And I have one more thing I want to do. And I need to get a palette knife that I forgot to pull out. All right, I'm back. I'm going to use, this is a banker's clasp. It's to hold money. It works, a palette knife works, but you want something stiff. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to drag it through the water. And I'm going to just kind of break up the surface of the water in places by dragging through the pastel. And it's just a very subtle way of creating some movement in the water. Sometimes I like to pull those lines up from the bottom. And I even pull it across that pond scum. It's very subtle, and I'm not even sure how well it shows up on the video. But those lines that you've kind of dragged pastel through the layers kind of reveal the underpainting, and it just creates a little bit more movement in the water. And the only other thing that I might do is come in and kind of just very gently knit my sky together so it's a little bit calmer. A lot of times you have a very, very busy foreground area, which I do here, and then you have a busy sky and it's just overwhelming. So you want areas of rest. So I think I'm at the point where I would stop, and a lot of times I'll let it rest. I'll come back to the painting with fresh eyes. Maybe I'll make a mark or two, maybe not. I will oftentimes put it in a frame or a mat. And when I put the mat around it, a lot of times I can tell better if I'm finished or not. So when I call this the magic mat. When you put the magic mat on the painting, it really allows you to see, that you might be more done than you think. But one thing that I do want to point out is, notice I didn't put a lot of detail around the edges. My goal, again, was to draw you in from across the room, hopefully interest you enough that you want to participate in the painting, create a visual journey, be aware of the D plus V plus C to get a good painting. So the design, I did a plan for the design, I did a plan for the value, I kept a limited palette of pastels so I could have control over my color, and I tried to slow down at the end of the painting so that I can think of all these things and be more mindful when I was making those final adjustments. So, I hope you've enjoyed this demo as much as I have enjoyed painting it for you. I hope you've learned some things. I hope you can apply some of these things to your own paintings to help you take your work to the next level. And I wish you much joy in your painting and success. Oh, I do want to say this. If you have questions, remember, if I didn't answer your questions, send me an email, KarenMargulis@gmail.com. Or you can comment on this video and I'll be able to answer that way. If you want to continue your online instruction, I have the Patreon page. It's Karen Margulis, patreon.com/Karen Margulis. You can go to my website and get a link to it too, but I would love to have you join our group over there. We have a lot of fun, and there's demos every week. And challenges and all kinds of stuff. So thanks again for inviting me into your studios, into your home. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration, this presentation, and I hope that I get to meet you one day in person. Thanks again, guys, and I'll see you soon.